Hi all, Wanton here, and welcome to a two-part series that will talk about the past and future of rogues in World of Warcraft. Today's video will be a look back at Legion, and will examine how rogues have fared through this expansion, the highs and lows of each spec, and my personal experiences playing the class in Mythic rating. Part 2 will talk about the upcoming changes to the class, and what lessons I hope the devs learned from Legion to make the class more fun and more balanced in Battle for Azeroth. Let's start by looking at the most controversial rogue spec, and the one that struggled the most throughout the expansion, Outlaw. When Legion launched on August 30th, 2016, it brought a large number of changes to many classes and specs. As part of this, Combat Rogue received one of the largest reworks of the expansion, actually being renamed to Outlaw, and basically rebuilt from the ground up around a pirate theme, with only a few abilities even sharing names with what Combat had had before. One of the new mechanics was a new baseline finisher called Roll the Bones, which would actually roll 6 dice with real probabilities and give you 1, 2, 3, or 6 buffs based on the result. Basically from the moment this was announced in Alpha, people began to voice their displeasure at having such large RNG swings in your rotation. Worse yet, because Roll the Bones cost combo points but had no cooldown, optimal strategies for using it involved re-rolling it over and over until you achieved a result of 2 buffs. Ultimately, despite months of feedback, this went to live unchanged, and unfortunately for everyone, early sims actually showed Outlaw as the top rogue spec, which meant raiders began grinding their hundreds of artifact power and putting it into their Outlaw weapon, working towards getting their gold traits. I was a pretty new rogue player at this time, and personally, I was having a lot of fun with Outlaw in Mythic dungeons. Blade Flurry was still a 35% cleave at this point, and with March for Death and the insanely strong Fatebringer, which gave full reduction per point back then, Outlaw could do really good AoE damage in dungeons. In some ways, this was the high point of Outlaw for the whole expansion. Unlike Assassination or Subtlety, it had no dots or setup time, making it ideal for dungeons, and the spec's weaknesses were naturally shored up in a dungeon environment as well. March for Death generated tons of combo points, which reduced the pain of re-rolling Roll the Bones, and there was time in between packs for your miserable energy regen to get you back to full. Not to mention that Outlaw was the only rogue spec left with decent crowd control, which gave it another useful niche at places like Blackrock Hold, where lots of single target interrupts were needed. All of this came crashing down when just 3 days after the release of Emerald Nightmare, Outlaw received some nerfs, which along with some buffs to Assassination, meant that 3.5 weeks into the expansion, Outlaw was basically dead for raiding. It would quickly fall to joke or meme status, which it kept for the next 15 months and 4 raids. Actually, there was one other point during this time that was my second and last high point of Outlaw, the only Mythic progression boss where I actually played Outlaw on the kill, Mythic Odin. At this point in time, True Bearing was still a 2-second reduction on cooldowns per combo point spent, and most importantly, these cooldowns included Sprint, Grappling Hook, and Cloak of Shadows. With Odin having an annoying mechanic that targeted everyone in the raid and would one-shot you unless you ran to a specific part of the room to grab a buff, having Cloak of Shadows every 30 seconds made this fight much easier. Not to mention that Phase 2, the longest and probably hardest phase of the fight, involved a lot of target swapping, making Assassination a pain. So for convenience, I actually chose to play Outlaw in this fight, and looking back on it, this fight remains one of my favorite memories of Legion raiding as a result. So, with Outlaw becoming a meme for raiding, rogue players hopped over to the spec that was quickly becoming one of the top single-target DPS in the game, Assassination. With the changes in Legion, the spec had been solidified around being a master of bleeds and poisons. Originally, this meant that 2 Assassination builds were possible, an Exsanguinate-based build relying on bleed damage, and a build using Agonizing Poison. The Exsanguinate build had a very unique and fun playstyle built around accelerating your dots, which, as far as I know, is a unique mechanic not present anywhere else in WoW. Unfortunately, bleeds don't scale with mastery, and poisons do, which meant that as gear got better, there was only one thing that could happen. Agonizing Poison became the default choice, and Assassination Rogue truly became the Tunnel Lord spec. Although the base mechanics of the class already make target swapping hard with 2 required dots and a primary cooldown that can't change targets, Agonizing Poison took this to a whole new level. With only a 20% chance to be applied by attacks and a maximum of 5 stacks, swapping to targets that would live less than 20 seconds was basically pointless. This was both a blessing and a curse, since thankfully, the DPS of Assassination Rogue was very high at this time, which meant that raid leaders who understood your spec would simply let you ignore adds and hit the boss, and with the reduced cloak cooldown from your artifact, you got to ignore most other mechanics too. So, even though the talent did pigeonhole the class into a niche, for most of Tier 19, Assassination was the undisputed king of that niche, and this was definitely the high point of the spec for me. The rotation was slow, but methodical and calculated, and Vendetta had a nice 45-second cooldown that lined up with Kingsbane. This culminated in what was possibly my favorite point of the expansion, Mythic Croesus. As the fourth boss of Nighthold, Croesus was a brick wall for most guilds, a very tight DPS check that required pretty much everyone in the raid to have 54 traits in their artifact. Compared to Trilliax before, which was a 10-pull boss, Croesus was a 100-pull boss, was regularly 3-healed, and even then required the healers to be DPSing as much as possible throughout the fight. The timing of this fight coincided exactly with the peak of Assassination Rogue, and although the rotation was by no means terribly complicated at this point, the Titan Rage meant that every single point of damage mattered, and I could probably spend hours talking about all the tiny optimizations I made in my rotation on this fight, but I'll spare you that for the time being.
Let's fucking go. Oh my... Let's fucking...
Do it!
Go.
Yes! Yes!
Fuck yes! Holy shit.
Assassination continued being a very strong single target spec for the rest of Nighthold, and was also key for Tichondrius and Gul'dan, where their strong defensive cooldowns became important for soaking certain boss mechanics. Sound familiar? The spec remained in the same form, relatively unchanged, until 7.25 and the Great Rework. So at this point in Legion, Nighthold was well underway, and with 6 to 8 months of the expansion already over, it was becoming clear all three rogue specs had big issues that needed to be addressed. Outlaw still had the same Roll the Bones issues it had had since day one of Alpha, and Blade Flurry had been nerfed for some reason, further removing the spec's only useful niche. The spec also had horrible energy problems, having no built-in energy regen mechanic except for its mastery, which hadn't changed since Cataclysm when it was added. Assassination rogues were tired of being forced to tunnel the boss for about 6 to 8 months now, and Subtlety, which we hadn't mentioned at all until now, had its own suite of problems. Although it was technically competitive with Assassination on some fights, the spec strictly required the use of legendary boots, without which it basically didn't work. It had a built-in teleport on every Shadow Strike, which could cause serious problems in raiding. Its AoE rotation literally just consisted of multi-dotting with Nightblade. Symbols of Death was a really boring maintenance buff, and it had one of the worst designed artifact traits of all time, Flickering Shadows. Not only did this require you to use your sprint as a DPS cooldown, you had to avoid taking any hits for 3 seconds after using it, including dots and raid AoE, or it would break and the whole thing would be wasted. So, along with 7.25 and the release of Tomb of Sargeras came the Great Rework. Blizzard responded to the players and presented a large number of changes to all three rogue specs. As part of this, Subtlety had Nightblade changed from less of a damaging dot to more of a debuff, and Flickering Shadows was changed to be not dumb. Shadow Dance was changed to be more rare, but got a talent named Dark Shadow that increased all damage done by 30% while in Shadow Dance. Symbols of Death was redesigned to be a short DPS cooldown, and the devs added a new passive called Shuriken Combo that gave you more damage on eviscerates if you hit multiple targets with Shuriken Storm. Oh, not to mention, this spec also got 2 charges of Shadow Step because they said it's a ninja and should be the most mobile rogue spec. I have to hand it to Blizzard here, because they heard the concerns of a class community and responded with really solid targeted changes to all three specs. Not just a numbers buff or a talent tweak, but what constituted basically a major rework of Subtlety, and a pretty big one for Outlaw. So although I may often shit-talk Blizzard, I have to say that they did knock it out of the park with the 7.25 rogue changes, and Seth, who I believe was the designer behind these changes, remains one of my favorite Blizzard developers to date. So, with a new tier to shake up the meta and massive buffs, it was time for Subtlety to be king. Although Shadow Dance uptime was now smaller, with Master of Subtlety, Night Stalker, Dark Shadow, and Symbols of Death, you could stack a lot of damage increasing buffs on each other during Shadow Dance, resulting in massive burst. The discovery of a small bug with Death from above, which let you activate Shadow Dance in the last 0.3 seconds mid-flight, cemented this as the best rogue build for Tomb of Sargeras, as you could now get even more burst into your 4-second window. On top of that, after 9 months of raiding as Assassination, Rogue now finally had AoE damage, as DFA had an AoE component, and Shuriken Storm give you insane eviscerates when adds were around to cleave off of, making fights like Desolate Host and Mistress basically a Subtlety rogue's dream. The spec's cooldowns were also masterfully implemented in this new iteration, since Symbols of Death was up every 30 seconds, Death from Above was available for every symbols, Deepening Shadows gave you a Shadow Dance charge about every 30 seconds, and Vanish was up every 90 seconds. This gave the class an extremely smooth and satisfying rotation of bursting really hard with Symbols DFA Dance every 30 seconds, and then getting an extra hard burst window with Vanish on every third Symbols. Since these cooldowns always lined up, and most of your damage happened in these short 4-second windows, this allowed you to use the rest of the fight doing whatever you wanted. In a way, it was the opposite of Assassination and Outlaw, which typically spent the whole fight being glued to the boss. Subtlety in Tomb of Sargeras was at its high point, and in fact, this version of Subtlety is probably the most fun I've ever had playing a DPS in World of Warcraft. Unlike Assassination, the rotation had fast moments that required high APM, but it wasn't just constant button mashing like some other specs. The cooldowns made sense with each other, and it didn't feel like your class design was at odds with itself. The talent choices had a badass active ability to spice up your rotation, but didn't flood you with 7 new buttons that ruined the flow. Once again, I have to give props to Blizzard, as the 7.25 Subtlety rework is, in my opinion, some of the best class design they've ever done. That's it for part 1. If you enjoyed this video, stay tuned for part 2, where I will be looking at the patch notes for the BFA beta and talking about what lessons the devs learned and what issues still remain. If you found this video interesting, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment. Thanks for watching.